Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm going to do my 14.15 mid-lane tier list. So if you have content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a lot of changes this patch. We saw directly elite skewed buffs towards certain champions to try and increase their ability to be picked more competitively and kind of shift the meta around from what we've had it as a while in competitive and high elo. Obviously, this doesn't really affect average play as much. These champions were either already in a relatively fine spot or just slightly underperforming maybe, and then the marksman meta, which has obviously been quite a consistent thing in pro and elite, doesn't really have the same level of traction in average play as well. Obviously, like in the top 15 champions, not a single one are the ranged marksmen, which are really dominating in competitive at the moment. The nerfs have definitely kind of pushed these down over time, but really at the strength, it was only Tristana and Corki which were finding a huge amount of pick rate and, well, in Tristana's case, success. In Corki's, not so much success. He was already underperforming pre the changes which were brought in on 14.13 to kind of put him in a more balanced spot. But let's cover the changes. So the D tier is going to consist of relatively similar champions. We have the likes of Caitlyn, Lucian, Varus, if I can find Varus, Ezreal, Tristana is going to be within my D tier, Corki. These are the six marksmen which are now in my D tier. All of them have been affected in some manner of way, either through direct nerfs in Ezreal and Varus' case, and obviously Corki and Tristana both received direct nerfs in previous patches. All of these champions have either or in some way been affected by system changes as well, whether this is like fleet, absorb life, the itemization system. In Varus' case, he was probably the, Varus and Tristana were pre-going into this split. Some, like, seen mid lane sometimes. In Corki's case, it was different because he obviously got reworked going into this split with the more focus on, obviously, his AD builds and playing more as an early game aggressive, easy to play champion, which was, like, Riot's criteria for this pick. In turn, all these picks now do quite heavily underperform for the average player. If you're not coming out of lane with like a 20-30 CS lead with a couple of plates and maybe a solo kill or two on your opposing, or like a kill or two on the opposing laner or jungler, then you will really struggle to find your traction. They oftentimes aren't as good at side laning and will definitely get punished against certain tanks and mages, which will, in situations like, outscale them or just have more ways of playing around the functionality of their kits. In Corki's case, he's being nerfed in 14.16. Obviously, he's still a mainstay within competitive at the moment. His ability to have range combined with early aggression, combined with a level of assassination potential later on into the game, has created quite an unhealthy playstyle for him there. And it'd be nice to see if they try and push him back towards bot lane, as that was kind of one of the intents of the changes, but it never really came to fruition. He saw one patch of play there, and then with the E nerfs, it kind of got pushed back down, and he is going to sit within my D tier. The only other champion here is Azir. Azir got heavily nerfed because of competitive. They took some W damage off him. They took a lot of sustain through HP per 5. And it's just over time hurt him quite heavily. He was kind of pushed towards Fleet and Grasp when they made the changes towards his soldiers applying on-hit abilities, but enabled them to like function on them, and that led to him being a bit too safe in laning phase, which is why they did these changes to try and tag him down. But as a result of like Fleet being nerfed more recently, it's definitely hurt him to the point where it can be really hard to get out of laning phase to get to those points where you can really like dominate in mid-game team fights with the amount of AP damage you can dish out from long range. Moving on to the C tier then. So we have the other three marksmen on this tier list from bot lane to mid lane marksmen. That would be Zeri, Smolder, and Kai'Sa. All three of these champions, I'd argue, do outperform the D tier champions. Smolder and Kai'Sa are less affected by like the rune changes and the Smolder less by the build changes. Kai'Sa less by the rune changes. She ran Halo Blades a bit more frequently. She can also opt into some more AP heavier builds. In Smolder's case, he was running more caster heavy builds with like your Trinity, your Manamune, Shojin, RFC, LDR, BT, like these items haven't really been nerfed as much. Well, I mean, none of them have been nerfed outside of LDR, which is just the 5% armor pen. He did get hit by rune nerfs, obviously. Fleet and Absorb Life being a bit weaker early on to the game have definitely hurt him a bit, but he's still a solid C-tier champion. He got buffed up more recently, and that has definitely helped him find a bit more success here. In Zoe's case, she was arguably the best outright of these picks. With her being a really solid scaler, having relatively good wave clear with static shiv, being able to like flex mid, top, and ADC, and just being outright in a pretty solid spot for the most part. She was definitely a B tier pick last patch. Going into this patch though, I've dropped her down a tier as the static nerfs and the fleet nerfs have definitely hurt her enough to kind of merit this move. But all three of these champions definitely do outperform the ones in the D tier. If you're looking for like a more consistent marksman option, I would recommend these three over them. If you want other ones though, then obviously Akshan still exists. He is obviously designed to be a more solo queue mid lane orientated champion, which he does find success here. As a more niche one than Quinn, I would honestly recommend. Like, Quinn is in a really good spot at the moment. Definitely something you could find a lot of success on. The other picks within my C tier are Katarina, who is getting buffed in 14.16. She's still she still underperforms like a relatively large amount at the moment. She's kind of lent more towards like your Kraken Slayer builds, and then like it's kind of predicated on getting like an early snowball going to stay relevant and have an advantage within the game. They're trying to buff up her AP builds, which I'd argue is a more healthy playstyle for her to kind of like revolve around, rather than being like an on-hit proc reliant pick where it can feel kind of in some ways worse or like less consistent than some of the other just outright raw AP builds. She's a very hard to play champion as well. I don't imagine this pick is in a good spot if it's ever like in the A and the S tier. Then she becomes oppressive and can definitely just outright take over and snowball games too consistently. Hard to play pick. If you put the games in, you can be rewarded. Definitely going into 14.16 where she is being buffed. Kiana is an incredibly elite skewed AD mid laner. This is pretty well known. For the average player, this pick is about as strong as it's going to be. I don't imagine we're looking at buffing Kiana at any point soon. If you can play the map correctly, look for the angles where she can really like look for, have all-ins with the like ult and the execute on the rock queue, then you can definitely snowball games, you can take over, but if you can't pilot the pick that well, you'll get punished for it, and she can definitely fall victim to just being stuck on the tower for a lot of the game if you're never able to really find the ways out and the angles you need to get these combos down. Ryze is, I'd argue, an underrated pick. Obviously, he's kind of bound to like your AP heavy builds at this point. Like, you don't really see any hybrid tank variants of Ryze anymore. That's kind of died down with the sort of the nerfs he received back along, combined with buffs towards his AP ratios, which does just incentivize AP heavy builds. I heard, from what I've heard, Riot are planning on taking away the mana cost on Ryze, because whenever they're strong enough to like function, they become it creates like really bad gameplay patterns for this champion, where he's opting into items which you really just shouldn't be allowed to opt into. Whether this is like Frozen Heart, Winter's Approach, and then it like creates like too strong, or makes him too strong within competitive, as he is like his defensive outputs are just too good. And yeah, it's gone to the point where, I imagine they should just take away the mana ratios and kind of just make him a full-blown mage. That'll probably be a more healthier spot for him to be in. But he has good damage, he's good setup, he scales relatively well. His early laning can be punishing if you're not able to really find, if you're like in bad matchups. But for the most part, he's not a bad spot. He's just underpowered, arguably, to the rest of the mid lane roster. Zoe, obviously very popular within the East. Not so popular in the West. Obviously, she saw a game in the lower tier of the LCS. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but Blue Otter, mid laner, played it for a game. They played Fleet, Protobelt Zoe, playing a more like mobility, roam heavy Zoe build, where you're not opting into like the mana item early, and you're not opting into like an electrocute, which is like more solo queue orientated, I'd argue, where you're playing like around your burst, playing around your ability to snowball in the game, which she has to do. She's incredibly predicated on early item advantages, being able to use those to really just take control of the game and close out before she begins to struggle to kill targets in like a bubble combined with a Q. But yeah, Zoe, if you can pilot the pick well, definitely does gain power, but not something I'd really recommend learning at the moment, not until it's at least a bit stronger. The other pick moving down to the C tier is going to be Orianna. She is struggling more into some of the AD picks which have been buffed up this patch. The likes of Zed, Yone, Yasuo, Neferi, all pretty bad matchups for her. And they're all pretty, well, I mean, they've gained a bit of popularity, especially Yone, Yas, Zed. I believe Yas and Yone are 1-2 for mid lane popularity. I think Zed's like 4 or 5. I don't think he's number 3. I think LeBlanc's pretty high up there at the moment as well. But yeah, Orianna struggles into a lot of these matchups. She is being buffed also in 14.16, which should definitely help the pick, as it is underperforming at the moment. Moving on to the B tier, we have Cho'Gath and Malphite as my tank options here. Both these have really good matchup scenarios. In Cho'Gath's case, he can play quite nicely into melee with Emax being quite stat checky at this point, having that ability buffed up quite a bit. His Q is also a great tool for more ranged heavy matchups, where you can run the likes of Arcane Comet and play more as a poke mage. Obviously, you don't really have AP variants of Cho'Gath anymore. You're primarily gatekept to the tank build, which would be like your Warmog's Heartsteel, and then into full tank items like your Kanix, your Formails, stuff like that, which can all work quite nicely on him. In Malphite's case, he is a really good answer into AD comps where you're playing into maybe like a Jace, a Yasuo, a Yone. You can really utilize your E, your W max with Grasp. Into more range matchups, you can play obviously Q max, or into Jace. I'd argue Q max can work quite nicely, where you're really chunking him out with his lack of sustain, punishing him if he ever tries to trade with you, utilizing your passive and your hefty Q damage. Overall, you can go the AP build. It obviously doesn't have the same level of consistency, nowhere near as much in fact. This would be like the Lichbane Nash's siege heavy build, where you're playing around your W reset and the amount of damage you can do with that. It can definitely create interesting scenarios where it can be good, but not something I'd really recommend as much. I'd argue the AP build probably falls more close towards the C tier. The tank build, if you're playing in the right spots, is a solid A. Even S tier build as a S tier pick, as it's really easy to play. It can be really strong in the correct games, and yeah, definitely a really solid B tier pick at the moment for Malphite. Moving on from these two, we have Zed, who is, got adjusted this patch. The changes didn't really do a huge amount to shift him. He's still relatively similar for the average player, just a bit stronger early on, a bit weaker later on. Obviously gaining 20 damage at max rank of Q at level 9, that is a really nice buff. It makes his lethal thresholds really aggressive. On top of this, they nerfed his ability to snowball by taking 10% AD ratio off the Q, so you need 200 AD to now even that back out, which is item 4-5 in a lot of situations. It really depends on what you opt into, whether you're opting into things like Voltaic Cycler Sword, Eclipse, Edge of Night, Grudge. There are options there, but Zed, he also got nerfed on the ultimate as well. The ult CD did go up at later ranks, which does hurt his pick potential later on, but for the most part, he's still a relatively similar champion. His ban rate is 27% at the moment, which is kind of high, but not the highest it's been by any means. So you could definitely find success with this pick. It's a bit hard to play, but yeah, Zed, solid B tier pick. Definitely play around with the buffs which he's received more recently, and you should find that you're having a fine time. Hui is one of the few champions which still goes Blackfire Torch after it got nerfed on the 14.10b patch in the mid lane. He really values the item, as he has a lot of AoE capability, really buffing up the AP, as that's what the item provides, dot and AP increase for everyone applied with that dot. Combined with that, you can opt into things like Liandry and just have a really burn heavy build. It can be quite oppressive to play against, and if you learn how to utilize all of Hui's abilities in the right settings, whether you're looking for wave clear, looking for CC, looking for just raw damage output, or ult combos, he's in a really good spot at the moment. And I don't think it would be healthy if he was an A S tier pick for the average player, but you'll be really rewarded if you put a lot of games into Hui. He is for elite, or just for people OTPs and people who put a lot of games into these picks. I honestly say that Hui is an A S tier pick, but for more generalistic audience, more a B tier, C tier pick. Moving on from Hui, we have Akali, who stayed relatively neutral this patch as well. She sits towards the low end of the B tier. He's definitely a bit weaker compared to pre-VE nerfs, which lost a lot of power within Solo Q. So you could argue she's C tier, because they were pretty aggressive, and not having the same level of kill threshold can definitely be quite punishing. But this patch, they did buff her R, they buffed her Shroud later on into the game, which doesn't really do anything. It was more just like a nice change and like a placebo late game buff. The main one is obviously the R at level 6 is a bit stronger. It did lose some cooldown, so you're not able to as consistently look for those angles, but when you're able to find that angle, it can be a really deadly all-in. And yeah, she's definitely a bit better for the better piloters of the champion. For the average player though, I'd say she sits at like a low B tier spot, but you'll be rewarded if you put games in, as most champions in the game. But in a lot of the mid laners cases, like they tend to be pretty high skill cap picks, which like really reward like 100, 200, 300 amount of games put in. So yeah. Moving on from Akali, we have Jace. So Jace is in a better spot at the moment with the Q buffs he received. He gained like 5 flat Q damage combined with 5% on the AD ratio. It makes his all-in thresholds slightly higher. Obviously, he took a bit of a hit with opportunity being nerfed, but you do have the ability to opt into Electrocute, which received early game buffs, which are quite nice for the Keystone. Overall, I'd argue mid lane Jace is in a pretty good spot at the moment for the average player. It can't go much higher as a lot of these picks here, as it'll become too oppressive and competitive. But yeah, for the moment, pretty good spot at the moment. Pretty good spot. The opportunity Manamune, like lethality build tends to be the way to go. This would be like Edge and Grudge as like 3-4 items, and yeah, pretty solid pick at the moment. Ziggs is a good artillery mage. Doesn't really have much going for him past his ability to siege and have long range harass. He does good damage, but not as high as obviously like your Syndras. He's not. He kind of falls into like the artillery burst mage artillery burst dot mage category. Like he fills all of them decently well, and yeah, he's very deserving of a B tier spot. He can be quite vulnerable if you run into like heavy assassin comps where his damage is more reliant on staying from distance and being able to just output Qs, output ultimates, drop E's down, play around his control. Yeah. Moving on from Ziggs, we have Talon. So Talon received adjustments this patch to his Q. Didn't really do anything. It was just a nice quality of life change. He stays relatively neutral, and that is going to be within my B tier. He obviously benefited from some of the changes he received back along. It pushed him back to the B tier, but he needs a bit more if he really wants to push up to the A to the S tier. And I'd argue that Talon has a bit more to gain. But it's probably where I'd say he sits at the moment. Obviously, you have like Keystone options and like Phase Rush, Electrocute, Conqueror, Dark Harvest, First Strike. Like there are loads of Keystone options. And honestly, if you're playing like your Keystone correctly, then you can definitely find a lot more success on this pick. Obviously, he works quite nicely into squishy matchups where you can really punish them. His level 2 obviously is really oppressive with the W and the Q power combined with Bleed and Ignite. There's definitely a lot of power to this pick. The death timer changes in 14.16 mode should be a huge win for this champion. I definitely believe that will be something which could see him push up towards the A tier. Moving on from Talon, we have Syndra, who is also being buffed in 14.16. She is in a fine spot at the moment. Obviously, a pretty good burst mage with solid CC tool, solid harass tools. She doesn't really excel at any sort of like metric at the moment. There are champions with higher like burst ranges. Obviously, if you're snowballing, then Syndra does have a really aggressive burst range with like a Q, E, Q combo combined with like a W land and an R can really comfortably like one-shot squishy targets if you're ahead of the curve. If you're not, you play more like a harass spot with like your Qs and then look for those punishing angles where you can. She's in a fine spot at the moment. You can opt into like Electrocute, you can opt into not Phase Rush. You can opt in, you can opt into Phase Rush, not something I'd really recommend at the moment though. Electrocute tends to also be quite nice on her, as Electrocute being buff at early game definitely does help a lot of these mages. But yeah, you got a lot of Keystone options on hand. You can go things like Phase Rush and Arcane Comet and even Summon Airy and find good amounts of success. Moving on from Syndra, we have Vladimir, who received buffs in 14.20 41-12, I believe, 41-12 or 41-13 to his W, and it did help him a bit. Obviously his W was by far and away his weakest spell. It allows him to use it a bit more offensively, get a bit more damage out of it, but wasn't really enough to push him up the tier list too much. It just moved him from like the C tier to the B tier. With some of the changes like this patch, he could definitely see an increase in power. With some of the changes this patch with the buffs towards Proto Belt and Cosmic Drive definitely do help him. So he does gain a bit of power from that. Maybe the Death Timer changes will help him as well, as he can look for more all-in angles with Ignite and definitely be something he opts into. But then a lot of champions will also similarly benefit, so it could also be more punishing for him being a bit weaker of a laner. Yone is going to move up a tier, so the other 3 champions which stay in this tier are going to be Twisted Fate, who lost a bit of power back when like AD Twisted Fate was really overperforming, and they nerfed some of his AP ratios to kind of tag down mid Twisted Fate as well. Overall, he's a solid B tier pick now. Ari obviously got nerfed as well on the W and the ultimate, losing a bit of her safety net and a bit of her CSing capability. She's still a solid B tier pick. Like, the B tier champions are by no means bad. I just recommend the A tier picks as being more consistent options, whether that's through being able to carry the game more consistently, maybe they're a bit easier to pilot, or maybe they just have better tools at the moment. In Ari's case, she's a high B tier option. If you put the games in, as with many of these picks, then yeah, you can definitely be rewarded, and yeah, high B tier. Talia, obviously really nice into like heavy mobility comps where you can get a lot of value out of your E. The W also a really powerful tool for disruption. The R is a bit of an elite skewed ability, and Talia oftentimes is more of an elite skewed pick. Like, it's the reason why she does see competitive a bit more frequently in the mid lane. But for the moment, she sits as a solid B tier option. Moving on to the A tier, I'm dropping Fizz. Well, actually, I'm going to drop Fizz down to the B tier. He is underperforming with some of the other champions, which have been a bit on the rise. I think Fizz could probably do with a slight buff. He is obviously primarily used as a punishing tool for like ASOL. It's one of the more common matchups I actually see. Obviously, his all-in potential is still very aggressive. If you are ahead of the curve, then it can be really hard to play into this pick, as his E is a very powerful tool, one of the most powerful which like a laner can have access to. Being able to output a huge amount of damage whilst dropping aggro and like looking for really potent dive potential. Overall, Fizz, yeah, probably sits at like a high B tier, low A tier option now. Moving on from that, we have Renekton, who is going to be a new addition to the A tier. He's been gaining popularity in the mid lane for a while. Overall, I really like Renekton mid. When you can go the likes of Q into W max with PTA, it creates really oppressive scenarios into the likes of Yasuo and Yone, who are more popular this patch. Renekton is a very good answer into both these champions. Definitely something I'd recommend learning if you are having problems with these picks. Overall, yeah, he's a solid A tier pick. Pretty standard, similar build as top lane, like your Eclipse, your Sun and Sky, your Cleavers, your Shoujins, your Sterics, stuff like that all work quite nicely on him, and he's a very solid A tier pick. Also moving down is going to be Sylas. So Sylas lost power this patch with the nerfs to him. He probably sits more like a mid B tier option. He's also going to receive some compensation buffs in 14.16 to help with the fact that they over nerfed him, but I'd recommend looking at some of his other builds, like your Roa, your Rocket Belt, your Cosmic Drive, looking to kind of be a bit more durable, losing a bit of damage, but you can play a lot more extended fights with the likes of Conqueror now. And it's definitely something worth looking into, as it does, well, I mean, it's unpopular at the moment, but definitely has more opportunity for like win rate gain and advantages within like the matchups. Other than that, we have LeBlanc. So LeBlanc is gonna move up to the A tier. I'd be kind of hesitant moving LeBlanc up, as she's a pretty hard to pilot pick, and like is also very reliant on snowballing, kind of akin to Zoe. But with the buffs she receives combined with some of the nerfs to other champions, she's definitely really been benefiting from that, and I think it's about time that she moves up to the A tier, combined with the fact that she's also really popular. Does kind of deflate her win rate, and yeah, that can often create kind of misaligned I guess targets with where this champion should be put. For the moment though, I do believe she belongs in the A tier, like a high B tier, low A tier, and if you play a lot of a pick, then you can really be rewarded. Like in high elo, she is definitely close to like an S plus pick at the moment, one of the best AP bin laners you can have access to. But yeah, there are other options which I'd recommend over LeBlanc for just the average general player. I'm actually missing Kassadin. I've just realized Kassadin is not within my C tier. Kassadin should be in the C tier because he's in a pretty weak spot at the moment. The nerfs going into the split hurt him quite a bit. It hurts his all-in potential, but tagged down to the AP ratio on his E. Hurts his snowballing. Hurts his late game agency, which he's kind of built around at this point. And if you can get to that point, then obviously he's a very strong champion. But it's quite punishing to get there. And oftentimes a lot of games can be closed out before he can really become relevant and find those angles for like scaling and winning out through that. Moving on from that, we have Nasus, who is also going to be my A tier. He is a pretty sleeper, strong mid lane pick at the moment. It's just primarily just Bruiser Nasus. You don't really want to be playing AP Nasus in most matchups. However, it can be situationally good into lanes where you really just can't stack and you need that long range harass capability. Maybe the enemy doesn't have a lot of sustain. Matchups like Kennen, for example, can be where you play the likes of AP Nasus if you're just never really able to find the angles to play into him. But yeah, there's definitely power there in the build, but for the moment, he's going to be my A tier. Lissandra, who is probably sat at like a low A tier, high B tier option at the moment. I'll put Lissandra high B tier. She's more situational. If you can find the angles to play the pick into like Zed, into like LeBlanc, stuff like that, where you can really neutralize the capability of these picks, then she can be really oppressive. But as a generalistic mid laner, she tends to fall a bit weaker, so I'm gonna drop her down to the B tier for the moment. Quinn, I'm actually going to move up. So Aurelia is the next champion here. She received some more base health, but lost a bit of her HP per 5, which is a bit more of a nerf within the mid lane, where she's more likely to get harassed than in the top lane, where she can find those all-in angles without really training too much of her HP, making it so the nerf doesn't really get felt as much as the buff. Overall, she's in a pretty good spot at the moment. If you can find the angles to snowball with Bork being pretty strong at the moment and Wit's End being buffed as like a second item option, she's a great A tier pick. And Morgana is not bad. Also sat like a low A tier option. She's easy to play, has good wave clear, has really good setup with her Q. Obviously, is reliant on setup to like land her Q, but if you can consistently land it outside of the setup, then it can really enable a lot of other champions to really thrive within the game. She doesn't really need as much econ as a lot of picks, and she can kind of play on like 2-item spikes with like Liandry or Blackfire, Liandry, Rylai, Zonya, stuff like that all work quite nicely on this pick. Really enabled her to output a lot of damage with W max, making it so she can be like sufficient at clearing waves and not just be someone where you can get punished by not having the ability to roam like other picks. Moving on from Morgana, we have Nico, who got buffed this patch with the protobot changes. She can also opt into Storm Surge in certain situations, enabling her to really snowball and find those angles. Obviously, she is pretty unpopular at this point, but definitely benefits from the likes of Rocket Belt being buffed as like a fast item rush. 100 more health can be the difference between winning a fight and losing a fight. Obviously, if you're able to rotate another combo because at 100 health, then yeah, it can be really powerful. Pantheon, this would be WMAX second Pantheon. Pantheon's been pretty good for a while, especially as like an answer to like Yasuo and Yone as well, where you can really utilize your aggressive playstyle early on into the game. You can opt into both Domination and Sorcery Tree in secondary, whether you're running like Mana Post Scorch or also like Sun Impact and Eyeball Collection, either or you're kind of playing on your early game aggression, your ability to consistently output larger amounts of damage and shut down their ability to really carry within the game. Overall, Pantheon has been in a good spot for a while. Definitely something I'd recommend if you're looking for a slightly easier to play AD mid laner compared to some of the other options which can be a bit harder to pilot. Vex primarily utilised as a counter pick, but in a pretty good spot at the moment. I know a lot of people really rate Vex quite highly, and I know a lot of people really rate Vex. I can't speak anymore. I know a lot of people rate Vex pretty highly, and a lot of people rate her really really low because of like the strengths of this pick. Oftentimes people see her as just being a bit null outside of matchups where she can utilize her where she can't utilize her passive. That would be like your high mobility matchups, your Relia, your Yasuos, your Yones. But she can work as a standalone pick. Like, she has the tools to output, like, artillery mage level damage. Not at the same distance, but, like, her Q does have a solid AP ratio. Her E, her W are pretty powerful tools as well. Obviously, her W requires her to be a bit closer to the target. kind of akin to the E. But yeah, she's at a pretty solid spot at the moment. Definitely deserving of an A tier. Definitely deserving of a spot in my A tier. Obviously, Electrocute being buffed also did help her quite a bit. She really values that Keystone quite heavily. Diana and Echo go next to each other as per usual. Both of them very solid early game aggressive options. In Echo's case, it is like the Halo Blade Scorch ease start into just trying to power through your laning phase, playing as a really solid assassin pick. In Diana's case, she has loads of harass capability with her Q, but she's incredibly early game skewed, obviously reliant on being able to snowball and take over the game, with her ultimate definitely being an ability which falls off quite aggressively throughout the game. And yeah, that could be quite punishing to play around if you're not like coming up lane with like 3-4 kills. Yeah, it can definitely be quite punishing in that aspect. In Akshan's case, he's arguably one of the best AD solo queue laners in the game at the moment. Definitely in elite play, he really feels that role like he's close to the S+ tier, arguably. For more average play, he drops down a couple of tiers. I put him in the A tier as yeah, I definitely think this pick can struggle if it's not really like heavily winning lane, but it has really good tools to win lane with. It does a huge amount of damage. It has great roam potential, has great all-in potential, and there's definitely a lot of power to this pick. Just not enough power to really merit it being in the S tier for the moment. And then the other 4 champions I have here, which are staying from previous patch, are Victor, Anivia, who is arguably like a really high A tier option, Vel'Koz and Swain, which are a bit more niche, but also arguably really good options at the moment. In Victor's case, he's kind of been forgotten as a pick, but he's definitely really thriving with the itemization at the moment. He can opt into things like Ludens, Lichbane, Blackfire, Liandry, and then like more defensive or more offensive options. And he can like really flex around depending on what he needs within the game. He can opt into things like Phase Rush, Summonary, Fire Strike, Electrocute even. All these route choices work quite nicely on him. In Swade's case, he tends to be a bit better in low elo, where you can more consistently stick to the target and utilize your full kit. In high elo, you're more likely to get punished and played around a bit better. He obviously is very strong in mid game and objective control situations. Does fall off a bit later on into the game, but it tends to be pretty like it has to be pretty late into the game for him to really like start losing power. But yeah, those mid-game team fights, he can be incredibly impressive with some of his item options at the moment, the likes of Rylai, Liandry, Malignance, Blackfire even, Zhonya's. All of them are really good tools for him, and he's a great A-tier pick for that reason. In Vel'Koz and Anivia's case, both are pretty niche, but both are really good champions in their own merit at the moment. Vel'Koz is a very solid artillery mage, Anivia, a great controller, does output a huge amount of damage. Obviously has been early game skewed for a while now, but still has great mid-game and late game tools for like control and being able to just output a huge amount of damage. But yeah, her level 6 is incredibly impressive. It makes it really hard for a lot of champions to ever really contest her on the wave. And oftentimes, she has really strong lethal angles, which a lot of people just don't really perceive her to really have. So, yeah, really solid A-tier pick. Moving to the picks being added to the A-tier, we have Yasuo. So, Yasuo goes up from low B to like a high B, high A, mid A option at the moment. He really benefited from his buffs to his Eva's patch and really pushed him and elevated him into a spot where he is very oppressive early on in the game. I mean, Yasuo for a while has been pretty early game, mid game skewed. He doesn't have the same level of late game agency he once did have. Whether this is through item changes or through changes to his kit, it's kind of shifted him very much towards being a very strong early game laner, where you have like a lot of front loading damage. The E obviously doesn't scale anymore, but it has really aggressive flat amount of damage. He did lose some power with Fleet and Kraken being nerfed, but definitely gained more from the buffs which he received directly to himself in this patch. In Asol's case, he got nerfed. He was pretty heavily overperforming, but they nerfed the Q mana cost, the E mana cost, the W range, and I believe they slightly nerfed the Q damage as well. All these changes have kind of resulted in him going from like an S+ pick to like an A pick, high A pick, but he's still very strong at the moment, definitely deserving of a high A spot. He could just be quite punishing to play onto some of the AD picks, so you have to be a bit more careful with some of the matchups you choose for him. My voice is completely gone. Moving on to the S tier. So we have Quinn. Quinn, really strong at the moment. Really benefiting from not taking a hit like a lot of the other champions, with Symbiotic Souls being in a really strong spot. Her itemization is really good. This is the Profane Hydra Electrocute variation. And yeah, she's really deserving of an S tier spot at the moment. Being added are Kennen and Set. Both these champions also really deceptively good mid laners at the moment. In Kennen's case, he received buffs through Protobelt and Storm Surge being buffed this patch. In Set's case, he's been good in the mid lane for a while, really strong into a lot of the melee matchups, and could oftentimes shrug off a lot of the ranged matchups through the likes of D-Shield, Second Wind, his passive. It can make him pretty good in the mid lane at the moment. Other picks include the likes of Yone, which is being added to... Well, I'm actually going to add Yone to the high... Do I add Yone to S or A? So, okay, Yone is really good, like, in a really good spot at the moment. The Q buffs were huge for him. It massively helps his ability to trade with opponents, and it massively helps one of his weakest points within the game, which is, like, trying to get towards first item, and then, obviously, scale up, being really powerful later on into the game. Does this, for the average player, it's not as aggressive of a buff. Obviously, Yone is a pretty hard to play pick, but, it's arguably enough that it does actually just put him in the S tier. I'm kind of hesitant, but yeah, I actually do think he probably just straight up deserves a spot here. Obviously, Fleet tends to still be his best performing keystone, but Conqueror is definitely something you can opt into very extended, heavily extended trade patterns where you're playing against like multiple tanks in a composition, and yeah, he's a very solid S tier pick, honestly. Other picks here include Veigar and Lux. They can kind of sit in the middle of this. They're both pretty easy to play picks. Veigar has a lot of value at the moment with his cage. His damage is very high, and he's very powerful for those means. In Lux's case, her wave clear is one of the strongest in the game. She is very hard to play when she is play against when she is snowballing. When she falls behind, she can act still quite nicely as a snare bot and a slow bot, but you will definitely notice the lack of damage on this pick. It's one of the most like polarizing things within the game. The difference between like a head Lux and a behind Lux. But yeah, she's still very deserving of an S tier spot. Malzahar and Zareth are arguably two like lower down S tier options, but in Malzahar's case, it's very easy to play. Like, he's a very cookie cutter mid laner. You push waves with your E and W. You look for angles with your ultimate, and you can utilize the strengths of your teammates to really make this pick function quite well. Obviously, if you find yourself being punished too heavily, or you're getting into the higher ranks and you're not able to find those advantages you really want in lane, and you're being like outshoved like early on, and that can be quite punishing. Obviously, but Malzahar's basically uncontestable shove. Once you have like first item, whether this is like your Blackfire, your Leandre, your Rhyhorn, all these could be quite nice on him. And yeah, he's very deserving of an S tier spot at the moment. Cassiopeia actually is going to drop down to my A tier. I'm actually going to have Aurora in my A tier as well at the moment. Both these picks, okay, in Aurora's case, she got hotfix nerfed and then hotfix buffed, so she went from being like A to C, or she went from being like S to C to A. It's kind of hard to really place her correctly at the moment. I believe she probably sits in the like a mid A tier pick at the moment. Obviously, her win rate doesn't really suggest that. It's at like a 48.5% win rate, but it will increase, and like, I believe people will catch on to like the correct builds, whether like they've adjusted with all the changes which have come through, combined with the fact that people will learn the kit more consistently, and yeah, she's very deserving of an A tier spot, in my opinion. And in Cassiopeia's case, she lost a bit of power with the AP ratios nerfs towards both her E and Q. Definitely did hurt her quite a bit, so she dropped from the S tier down to the A tier. The mana changes didn't really change her build, so that's kind of unfortunate, but yeah, it allows her to be a bit more spammy within laning phase, but just with a bit less damage accessible to her. Other picks within my S tier, we have the likes of Brand and Neferi. So Brand is a very easy to play champion. Obviously, has been kind of like flavor of the couple of patches at this point. He did get like continuously chain nerfed to the point where he's no longer like one of the best AP mid laners. He kind of sits at like a low S tier option, but his ability to team fight later on, the amount of DPS this champion can output is almost uncontested. It is incredibly aggressive, and he has lots of flex potential going in like 4 different roles. Can make him really powerful, and yeah, he's a very solid S tier pick. moving on from brand, we have Annie, who is also a very easy to play pick. Has the benefit of Tibbers being having like loads of items which can really synergize with Tibbers at the moment. This would be like Malignance, Rhyolite, Leandry, stuff like that, which can like really amplify Tibbers' ability to do stuff within team fights. Obviously, Annie herself can play as like a burst mage, whether you're like opting into more burst orientated items with like electrocute, stuff like that, which can work quite nicely on her. Or if you're already snowballing, she can quite comfortably one-shot targets. And yeah, she's also a really easy to play champion, very solid S tier pick. The other 4 picks here, so we have Heimerdinger and Garen, which are 2 niche mid laners. Obviously, Garen has been kind of more popular as of recent, has really strong matchups, which he can perform quite well into. Did lose a bit of power with Xerxes being nerfed, but then like a lot of champions received nerfs with Sorks, Mercs, and Steel Caps being tagged down a bit, and same goes for Lucids. So it kind of evens out across the board. Overall, this champion's pretty easy to play, has really clear strengths, can shrug off most harass matchups. Obviously, tends to be a bit weaker in those situations, but it has incredible all-in potential and can be quite powerful. Heimerdinger, for the longest amount of time, has been my like a hidden pick. Like this champion's been very strong within the mid lane, really thriving off the itemization this patch, and Although he's unpopular, he's a great mid and top lane option at the moment, very deserving of an S tier spot. And then we have Galio and Neferi as my 2 S plus champions. Neferi's caught on at this point. People have realized that this champion is very strong after the huge amount of buffs she received, allowing her to really snowball, be quite comfortably, be a relatively easy to pilot AD assassin. Could like have great roam potential, scales really well. There's just a lot of strengths to this pick at the moment, and the buffs have definitely solidified her as being a great mid elo S plus AD champion. Obviously, the higher up you go, she falls off quite aggressively. Like by Diamond, I'd argue she probably falls to like an S tier pick, and then like into Masters and higher, like A, B tier. In Galio's case, he is a great answer to AP champions. If you're Galio kind of has to come in as like a counter pick. Previous patch, I would have said you can just blind Galio and ban Neferi for the most part in mid elo and be fine. But with Yone being a really strong riser at the moment, that isn't really so much the case. So arguably Galio could drop down to the S tier, but just how much value this pick has into AP matchups where you're basically unkillable and you have great roam pressure, you have great itemization, it makes him really impressive to play against, and yeah, he is a very solid S plus champion at the moment. Those are my thoughts on the mid elo average player tier list. Obviously it can kind of bleed into low elo, a lot of these picks. Into high elo, it very much does shift. Like, a lot of these picks can still be piloted in high elo to success, but a lot of the easier to pilot picks will definitely fall off as people have stronger understandings of how to play against them, and the kits tend to be pretty limiting in like the amount of outplay potential. But yeah, those are my thoughts. So if I guys watching, I'll see you next one. Goodbye.